A federal judge in Texas handed down 30 to 100-year sentences in what the FBI has called the first Antifa-related domestic terrorism convictions. A group were found guilty in March of material support to terrorists after staging what they described as an anti-ICE noise demonstration. One of the protesters, Benjamin Song, shot at and wounded a police officer who responded to the scene. He was sentenced to the maximum 100 years in prison. But civil liberties experts I spoke with said some of the other convictions blur the line between political activism and domestic terrorism and set a frightening precedent. Because other members of the group, like Autumn Hill and Savannah Batten, had already left the area before the violence began, but were still sentenced to at least 50 years in prison each. A lawyer for Autumn Hill told me,
if you are at a protest and some violence breaks out, you have nothing to do with it. This case says those people out there peacefully protesting absolutely can be prosecuted and convicted.
FBI Director Kash Patel applauded the sentencings, saying acts of violence against our law enforcement partners will not be tolerated, and we continue our work to protect communities across the country from domestic terrorism. I go really deep into this case.
If you move, you will be shot. Do you understand me?
The underlying terrorism law that prosecutors used, and the rollout of presidential memos and legal moves by the administration to target left-wing dissent.
What's up, family? Real talk. A federal judge in Texas just dropped a hammer on Antifa terrorists, hitting their leader with 100 years in prison. And liberals are literally on the verge of tears, crying about it on live TV. So let me break this all the way down. So here's what actually happened, family. A few days ago, 8 people got sentenced in federal court in Fort Worth for attacking the Prairieland ICE detention center in Alvarado, Texas. This happened on July 4th of last year, which happened to be of 2025. Not some small time thing. This was organized, this was planned, and the consequences just got handed down. Benjamin Song, 25 years old, identified by federal prosecutors as the leader of this operation, got 100 years. 100 years in prison. That's a life sentence for a young man. The rest of the group got 50 to 70 years. One person who wasn't even at the protest itself got 30 years just for being part of the operation. You read that right. Not there. 30 years. Now, the media keeps calling this a mostly nonviolent protest, quote unquote. But if you think about that for a second, a mostly nonviolent protest. You know what happened at this mostly nonviolent protest? Benjamin Song shot a police officer in the neck. That's what happened. An officer got shot. That officer survived. But let's be clear about what we're talking about here. This wasn't some accident. This wasn't some misunderstanding that got out of hand. A man armed with a weapon fired at law enforcement during what they're calling a protest. And when Song fired that shot, he yelled, "Get to the rifles," quote unquote. Get to the rifles. That's not the language of somebody defending themselves. That's not somebody caught up in the moment. That's somebody executing a plan. And if you're calling that nonviolent, we're not speaking the same language. Song's attorney came out with a defense that he acted in fear when an officer raised his weapon at a fleeing protester. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's his perspective. But here's where the reality comes in. His mother gave a press conference outside the courthouse, and she tried to frame this whole thing as a warning to everyone else about speaking and protesting. She said, if you speak, if you protest, if you try to protect someone, if you are associated with the wrong idea, you could be turned into a symbol instead of treated like a human being. That's the narrative they're pushing. That's what the left is saying. Look what happens when you stand up for what you believe in. But here's what actually happened, family. These weren't people just speaking or protesting. They were planning and executing an armed ambush on a federal facility. There's a huge difference. You can have all the options you want in this country. You can march. You can hold signs, you can speak about policy, that's protected. But what these people did wasn't protected speech. It was an organized attack. That's what these people did. It was coordinated. It involved weapons. And one of those weapons went off and hit a police officer. That's when protests, quote unquote, stopped being the word we use here. The judge understood that, and the court understood that, and the law understood that. And now these 8 people are understanding it too, because actions have consequences. You can't organize an armed attack on a federal facility and expect a slap on the wrist. That's not how this works.
New at 4, 8 people convicted in last year's shooting at an ICE detention center in Alvarado learned their fates today. A federal judge in Fort Worth handed down lengthy sentences. The decision fueled protest among those claiming a violation of free speech. Andrea Lucia was inside the courtroom for the hearings. Andrea.
Yeah, the shortest sentence that we saw today was 30 years, and that went to a man who was convicted of concealing evidence in this case. Most defendants got 50 years. Then, of course, you had Benjamin Song, the apparent ringleader of the group, who was sentenced to 100 years in federal prison.
What's the call? Free the law! What's the call? Free the law!
The sentencing hearings were at times emotional. Family members, friends, even a high school history teacher testified to the character of those convicted. And at least 2 of the defendants were visibly crying. Several addressed the court directly, including Benjamin Song. He was convicted for the attempted murder of an Alvarado police lieutenant who he shot in the neck during last year's 4th of July protest over conditions at the Prairieland Immigration Detention Center. Today, he said he acted in fear only after that officer raised his gun at a fleeing unarmed protester. Song's mother repeated his statement at a press conference outside.
I know I am the person being judged, but I also know that a case like this can become a warning to everyone else. If you speak, if you protest, if you try to protect someone, if you are associated with the wrong idea, you can be turned into a symbol instead of treated like a human being.
A federal jury, though, found Song and 7 others present at the protest provided material support to terrorists, in this case, Antifa. The defendants have maintained they are not members of any group by that name. The 2 federal judges who split up today's hearings and handed down these sentences defended their decisions, with one of them saying that terrorism and violence are an assault to democracy. We also got statements from several top Trump administration officials praising the sentences. Those include statements from the acting Director of ICE, the acting U.S. Attorney General, and FBI Director Kash Patel, who in his statement said, today's sentences show the FBI remains committed to identifying, locating, and dismantling Antifa and its funding networks across the country. Attorneys for the defendants, though, say this case has gotten way too politicized, and they have vowed to appeal it. Reporting live here in Fort Worth, Andrea Lucia, CBS News, Texas.
Can't stop thinking about the group of protesters in Texas who were sentenced to prison yesterday. In case you missed it, a group of activists in Texas who last year had protested outside of an immigration detention center received egregiously long prison sentences yesterday. We're talking 50, 70, 100 years in prison. One guy who had not even shown up to the protest, but had moved anti-fascist magazines. And by magazines, I don't mean ammo. I mean physical magazines that you read. He received 30 years in prison. One thing that stood out to me, though, as somebody who researches policing, is that the sentencing judge said the reason these sentences were so long was because he wanted to send a message to other people thinking about protesting in a similar way. And if that
There's no way this app's going to want you to see this, so share, like, save, comment, whatever you have to do, make sure this gets out, because the leader of a protest in Texas just got sentenced to 100 years. 100 years, you heard that right. And his fellow protesters, the ones they're labeling as Antifa, got sentences of between 50 and 70 years. And somebody who wasn't even present at that protest that did turn violent got 30 years. Do you know how long the longest sentencing was handed down for the raid on the Capitol, for the insurrection? 22 years for one of the leaders of the Proud Boys. 22 years. And this guy His name is Brian Song, and yes, it did turn violent. He did pew-pew an officer in the collarbone. He did survive. I'm not saying he should not be punished, but what this is, it is an egregious overstep and a draconian ruling by these Texas courts to set an example of Antifa, this crazy organization to be anti-fascist is such a horrible thing these days, and they're setting an example by giving this former Marine 100-year sentences and his other protesters between 50 and 70. This country is turning. The way social media apps just like this are turning, and the way that the justice system is turning. Everything is at the behest of Donald Trump, and they do whatever he wants. It is an absolute double standard and should absolutely terrify each and every one of you, because you could be next.
Now, this is where it gets real important to understand what the government actually charged these people with. They didn't just go after Benjamin Song for attempted murder. That's part of it. But there's something bigger happening here. The government brought a charge that's rarely used in cases like this. They called it material support to terrorists. And this is the first time prosecutors have applied this statute in a purely domestic context the way they did here. So let me explain what that means in plain English, because this is the charge that changed everything for all 8 of these people. Material support to terrorists doesn't mean you have to be the one pulling the trigger. It doesn't mean you have to fire the shot that hits the officer. What it means is this: if you are part of the group, if you are helping plan it, if you are there supporting the operation, if you are providing assistance in any way, you are responsible. You are complicit. You are guilty, and that's the charge. And that's why people are upset about this sentencing, because it's broadening who can be held accountable. Take Autumn Hill and Savannah Batten. These two already left the area before the shooting even started. They weren't there when Benjamin Song fired that weapon. They weren't standing next to him. They weren't even present for the violence, but they still got 50 plus years in prison each. 50 years. Why? Because the court found they were part of the operation from the beginning. They helped plan it, they showed up, they participated, and then they left. But leaving doesn't erase what you were part of. Civil liberties experts are out here saying this blurs the line between activism and terrorism. They're saying it's setting a dangerous precedent, that if you show up to a protest and things get violent, you can now be prosecuted even if you didn't throw a punch or fire a weapon. And that's a conversation worth having. I hear that argument. I understand the concern about where this goes in the future. But here's the common sense truth that cuts through all of that. If you show up to an armed ambush on a federal facility, you knew what you were walking into. You knew. There's no way you didn't know. These weren't people surprised by what happened. This wasn't a peaceful march that suddenly turned bad. This was an organized operation with weapons and a plan. And if you're there, you are part of it. The law is saying something real clear. If you are providing support to people committing violence, you are complicit, period. This isn't about having an opinion about immigration policy or ICE or government. You can have whatever opinions you want. This is about the actions you take. This is about crossing the line from words to weapons, from speech to violence. And when you cross that line, the law comes for you, all of you. And this is where the judge made a decision that's got the left absolutely losing their minds. The judge didn't just hand down 100 years because he felt like it. There's a specific federal sentencing guideline that he used, and it's called the terrorism enhancement. And this isn't something judges throw around every day. It's rare, it's powerful, and it completely changes how the numbers work. Here's what the terrorism enhancement actually requires. The offense has to be calculated to influence or affect the conduct of government through intimidation or retaliation. And that's the legal language. So in plain English, it means, did you do this to scare the government into changing its behavior? Did you use violence to try to force a political outcome? And that's what makes it a terrorism enhancement. And in this case, that's exactly what happened. These people attacked a federal facility specifically because they wanted to intimidate the government, specifically because they wanted to change immigration policy. And that's the whole point of the ambush. Without this enhancement, the federal sentencing guidelines would have recommended somewhere between 20 and 30 years maximum. And that's what the baseline would have been. 20 to 30 years. That's still serious time, and that's still a significant chunk of somebody's life. But it's not 100 years, it's not life. The difference between 30 years and 100 years is the terrorism enhancement. Now, here's where it gets important, because the judge didn't just apply this enhancement once, he applied it to every single count against these defendants. And then he did something else. He ordered the sentences to run consecutively, not concurrently. Let me explain the difference because this is where the math becomes a hammer. Concurrent means you serve multiple sentences at the same time. You do 5 years plus 5 years plus 5 years, and you're out in 5 years total because they overlap. Consecutive means you serve them one after another. 5 years, then 5 years starts, then 5 years starts after that. You're doing 15 years straight. That's what the judge did here. He stacked everything consecutively, and when you stack sentences consecutively with the terrorism enhancement on every count, you end up with 100 years. And you end up with something that's essentially a life sentence for a 25-year-old man. And the judge said something important. He said he was sending a message. That behavior has consequences, and that this country won't tolerate this kind of violence. And the left immediately started comparing this, as you guys heard in this clip, with the man that's still on the screen right now, comparing this to January 6th. They're saying the Capitol defendants got lighter sentences, so this is unfair. They got an average of 26 months. 26 months for storming the Capitol building. Meanwhile, these people got 50 to 100 years for shooting at an ICE detention center. But here's what doesn't add up with that comparison. The January 6 cases involved rioting inside the Capitol, carrying massive arsenals of weapons, injuring 140 police officers, and discussions beforehand about killing members of Congress. That was serious. But the government could have used the same terrorism enhancement statute on those cases. They could have. They didn't. And when prosecutors did seek it in a small handful of January 6 cases, the courts rejected it. Said it was overkill. Said it would create unwarranted sentencing disparity. The courts pushed back. This judge didn't push back. He applied it across the board to every defendant in this case. One of the defendants was a young mother, an artist, a poet, never been in trouble with the law, no criminal history. The terrorism enhancement wiped all of that away, automatically made her a career offender in the eyes of the law. Her personal history, her character, her life, before this moment, none of it mattered anymore. But that's the thing. She was part of an armed ambush on a federal facility. That choice changed everything, as you guys can see.
It's shocking to all of us, devastating to the families. 50 to 100-year sentences. Those are essentially life sentences for all of the young people in this case, largely of whom were engaged in nonviolent protest at an ICE detention facility. How did we get here? So the government in this case sought a novel, first time that this has happened, use of a rarely used statute, the provision of material support to terrorists. And that has not been used in the purely domestic context for this kind of conduct. That statute also does not require any connection to a domestic terrorist organization or any kind of a domestic terrorist organization. When the government sought prosecution under this statute, they sought to seek a very dangerous precedent that now allows them to target any American engaged in protests that results in even the most minor damage to property destruction. Any American can be targeted that way now. It does not require ties to ANTIFA or to any domestic terrorist organization. It just requires one of these underlying statutes. That's a dangerous precedent, and what allowed them to stack these charges so high on Tuesday. On Tuesday, what happened is the federal sentencing, people were anticipating maximum sentences of 20 years, maybe 30 years. The way they reached this sentence is the judge used this very rarely used and the most extreme federal sentencing guideline called the terrorism enhancement to inflict maximum sentences on every count of conviction for these defendants, and then abused his discretion to do something that is very rarely done in cases like this. He ordered each sentence to be served consecutively, not concurrently. So each sentence is served consecutively, resulting in sentences for 50 to 100 years in these cases. That terrorism enhancement that I mentioned only requires that the offense is calculated to influence or affect the conduct of government through intimidation or retaliation. That's a very broad, has a very broad application, and the government in past recent years has sought that in a lot of these prosecutions that people don't pay a lot of attention to, and so now it's very broadly applied. Seeking it in this case meant that the guidelines, this sort of federal sentencing structure that's supposed to tailor a sentence to each defendant. My client, for example, a young mother to a 12-year-old daughter, an artist, a poet, never been in trouble with the law, never even missed a parking ticket. The sentences are supposed to account for all of these unique situations. The fact, that she has no criminal history. But the terrorism enhancement undoes all of that. It recommends a maximum sentence on every charge for every defendant. That's how it operates, because it automatically designates them as a career offender. It's particularly abusive in this case, though, because it results in a significantly unwarranted sentencing disparity in the United States amongst defendants that have been convicted of similar conduct. Now, in these kinds of cases where the government is bringing a novel charge under a rarely used statute and terrorism, you may only have a couple or a handful of cases that are relevant to kind of distinguish your client or show where the expected range should be. But in this case, we actually had 1,500 plus very recent federal prosecutions related to similar conduct that should have informed what these sentences should have looked like. And that was of the January 6 defendants. The January 6 defendants were involved in rioting, carrying massive arsenals of weapons, lots of discussions ahead of time that didn't exist in this case about targeting law enforcement, wanting to kill members of Congress, them actually storming the Capitol. And it resulted in injury of 140 officers in that case. The government in that case could have sought prosecution under this same material support of terrorism statute. They didn't for those defendants. And they could have sought the terrorism enhancement in those cases because it applied. I told you that vague, calculated to influence or affect the conduct of government, could have applied it in all of those prosecutions. It's only sought them in a small handful. And where they sought the terrorism enhancement, the courts then rightly decided not to apply it in the vast majority of the small selection of cases where they sought it, because they said it was overkill, not representative, and would result in unwarranted sentencing disparity. The average sentence in the Capitol riots, which had far more serious conduct than the Prairieland ICE defendants, was 26 months. So we have a massive unwarranted sentencing disparity here. What happened in the court in Fort Worth was unconstitutional and should concern everybody in this country in the direction that it is taking us.
So there you have it, family. A lot of fear mongering to absolve individuals from basically being made example out of to be held accountable. Because if you know the weight of the consequence, you'll think twice about it. So I do agree with the judge in regards of making an example out of someone. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, family, because I'm always open to the possibility of being wrong. With January 6th, as we know, when it came to the BBC network and Trump made his speech to peacefully protest in regards to the election before Biden became president, because our current president, President Trump, felt as though the election was rigged and said to basically protest peacefully. But BBC, the news network, remixed his speech and made it as though it incited violence when he never said no things about going basically up to the Capitol and attacking individuals of Congress. Now, it becomes speculative to see if this is actually a genuine conversation involving January 6th, because a lot of individuals will say those individuals weren't supporters of Trump or MAGA supporters, because the simple fact is it was individuals paid to basically be made out to seem like they're MAGA supporters or supporters of Trump, inciting violence and basically storming the Capitol, when it was actually the left, the Democratic Party, who's paid these individuals in a way of framing Trump to be disruptive and not a peaceful individual. As we know that Trump is not a typical politician, a part of the establishment. He's a successful businessman, highly known to be successful with his real estate. So him being not a part of the establishment and not going along with the get along, they had to find a way to frame him to not be elected again, but he is elected again. So with that being said, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I think that plays a part into the January 6th conversation, because these individuals, were they actually Trump supporters, or this was basically a premeditated plan as well, which tied into the Antifa conversation of these individuals storming the Capitol, all planned and premeditated to basically put this incident on Trump, as they like to mention it, and frame it as in Trump incited that whole thing for why it happened. But they got pardoned and got a slap on the wrist compared to this. Let me know, family, if I'm wrong in regards to those individuals not actually being Trump supporters, from my understanding, because that definitely changed the concept. And I think it makes it, the conversation and the context, because I think it makes it very disingenuous to say, oh, well, these individuals basically stormed the January 6th Capitol and they got light sentences, let alone pardon, from our President Trump currently. But the simple fact is, we know that the far left will use political violence in any way, shape, or form to stay in political power, being against our current President Trump, because he is basically trying to uphold American taxpayers' monies and not let fraud, and getting rid of the waste, fraud, and abuse, and also restoring law and order, as they don't like it, because in exchange of getting rid of illegal immigrants, then that exchange of basically getting votes won't happen to be guaranteed for the Democratic Party, because every illegal that stays in this country undocumented discredits another American taxpayer and legal immigrant who came in this country and done things the right way and actually vote to make sure their voice be heard. And also election integrity, which is why the Save America Act is a big conversation right now and highly supported by bipartisan from Democrats and Republican voters and supporters. But as you know, they have to get the votes. But not to change the conversation, speaking back to this, and let me be real with you for a second, family. Why are these people so upset? Because they're finally facing actual consequences. That's it. For years, left-wing activism in this country has been emboldened. These people have gotten away with too much for way too long. You had the Black Lives Matter riots, burning down neighborhoods, unacceptable, anti-ICE activists attacking federal facilities, pro-Palestine Democrators shutting down highways and blocking commerce. And the list keeps going. And somewhere along the way, violence and property destruction became normalized in certain circles. Breaking windows became activism. Blocking ambulance became civil disobedience. Blocking ambulances. Setting fires became protests. And the boundaries got blurred intentionally, and a lot of people in positions of power just looked the other way. Now the law is stepping in and saying something crystal clear. No, you can't do this anymore. Not on our watch, not under this administration, and suddenly people are panicking because accountability is back and restored. But here's what makes no sense to me. If you don't want to be charged with terrorism, don't participate in armed ambushes on federal facilities. That's the rule. If you don't want to do 100 years in prison, don't shoot police officers. This isn't complicated. This isn't some mysterious legal trap nobody could see coming. This is cause and effect. Simple as that. The left keeps trying to frame this as free speech being violated. That's a lie. You have the right to protest in this country. You have the right to disagree with government. You have the right to march and speak and organize. That's protected. That's sacred. But you don't have the right to shoot people. You don't have the right to organize armed attacks. And you don't have the right to use violence to force political change. The Constitution protects your speech. It doesn't protect your weapons against law enforcement. The judge said something important when he handed down these sentences. He said terrorism and violence are an assault to democracy itself, not to a policy, not to an administration, to democracy. Because that's what this is. You can't use guns and ambushes to get your way in a democratic society. We have laws for a reason. We have elections for a reason. We have courts for a reason. There's a reason why we have a separation of powers between the executive branch, the legislative branch, and judicial branch. That's how you change things in America. You vote, you organize, you make your case in court, you win some, you lose some. That's the system. What you can't decide, or what you can't do as well, your cause is so righteous that violence becomes justified by it. That's what you can't do and can't decide to do. And that's where every tyranny starts. That's where every authoritarian movement begins. And the court understood that. Now, the left is fear mongering. As I said, they're saying you could be next. And my response is simple. For what? If you're not planning armed ambushes, if you're not shooting at cops, if you're not participating in domestic terrorism, then you're not next, period. If you're worried you could face these consequences, maybe ask yourself why. Maybe think about what you're actually involved in. This is about the bill finally coming due. These people made choices and they showed up to an armed operation against a federal facility. Someone got shot, now they're facing the system. The administration is cracking down on far left extremism, and this country desperately needed that, because the simple fact is, even when it comes to disagreement, we are in a time in history when political violence in the form of disagreement and in a response of you disagreeing with someone because you're not somebody's yes man is violence entirely to the simple fact of disrespecting human life and basically erasing someone off this earth. That's how extreme things have gotten. Now, let me close this with something that matters, family. Galatians chapter 6, verse 7. Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked, and a man reaps what he sows. And for those living in faith, that's the law of sowing and reaping. You can't plant chaos and harvest peace. For everyone else, it's simple. For those who are non-spiritual, cause and effect. Your choices have consequences. These people made their choices. They showed up to an armed ambush. Someone got shot, and now they're reaping what they sowed. Drop a comment if you disagree. Subscribe, share this. Let the love supersede the hate, family. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.